Welcome to Corrections Mama 27 channel. Thanks for watching. Had to take a little bit of time off. Was going through some stuff and just need a little bit of time. But let's get back to it. So I want to talk today about the difference between Texas and Arizona prison. I worked 4 years in Texas and 22 years in Arizona. So there's a lot of big differences, and I'll tell you at the end which prison I preferred to work at, but you might figure it out before the end. So there's a lot of comparisons in the way the prisons are run between Texas and Arizona. I want to make sure that I disclose to you that there are some comparisons that I cannot make, because I only worked with female inmates in Texas. And so when it comes to inmate politics, gangs, and stuff like that, I really can't answer too many questions about that, because the women tend to have pseudo families over gangs. I'm sure there are some gang members or activities that might go on, or cliques or whatever going on, but it's more like cliques. It's generally, back then in the late 90s, the women, I wasn't aware of any gangs that the women participated in. So that being said, I can compare just general operations and rules and inmate behaviors and different things like that, and that's what we're going to get into. So first of all, let's talk about Chow. The biggest difference that I noticed between Arizona and Texas is that Texas is far more organized. The inmates, seriously, the movement is more organized, and the way everything is orchestrated as far as work turnouts, Chow turnouts, the way Chow is run and conducted. I'm going to tell you specifics about that, about all of these different points. But it is night and day. When I went from Texas to Arizona, I was a bit shell-shocked. I really expected Arizona to be a pretty tough prison, because I had seen a video that they played in briefing for us in Texas when Lumley was killed. It was like an A&E thing, and they made Arizona out to be a tough prison. That wasn't the case. It was very unorganized. A lot of unsafe activities went on there. And I worked at the Lumley unit, and so I'll do a video about that on another time. So anyway, when you turn out Chow, they call out Chow by the building. They don't mix the buildings, because the closer the building is to admin was the lower custody. So basically, you get to move towards the admin building the more your score drops to a lower drop. The further away you are from admin means the higher custody you are. So at Lane Murray unit, we had building 1, 2, 3, and then we had J building. I'm not sure why they called it J building, but the J build, I think it was what they called it, and that was the lockdown unit. Those were single cell inmates that were disciplinary problems, that were high custody inmates, that were violent, or that had made serious infractions against the rules, or they were like murderers and stuff. But it wasn't the death row. Some of those inmates in J building were actually doing 20 years or more. And they probably had trouble. They just had trouble with them. Their custody level was a 5, or actually, it's probably a 4. I think the 5s were the death row. And then there was a fence that separated buildings 1, 2, and 3. with J building, and then we had F building. F building was behind that fence because it was a dorm where the inmates in the lockdown building, they graduated from there and they behaved better and they did their time in lockdown. So they got to go over to F building, and F building was a really big dorm, and it was split up into I think 4 different dorms, and there was also 2 stories. So those inmates would graduate from the lockdown to that, still behind the fence. Some would be able to stay there, and some got into trouble and went back to lockdown. And then the majority of them would eventually do better and be able to graduate to building 3 on the other side of the fence. Now, the Chow Hall was in the front of the fence. So buildings 1, 2, 3, line control, and Chow Hall. Line control was where they kept the pepper spray, where they kept, the restraints. That is where all the radio traffic had to go through. And it was very busy, and they're the ones that called out the inmates for different work crews. They're the ones that ran and decided when Chow was and what building turned out. They basically kind of were the brain. Then there was the main control, which was an admin area, and they're the ones that checked in people and monitored the radio and answered the telephones and things like that. So it was a little bit different than Arizona. Arizona just had a main control, and that was it. They didn't have a line control. So when they would turn out Chow in Texas, inmates had to put their hands behind their back and walk in a straight line behind each other, and there would be a painted line on the sidewalk that left them a couple of feet to walk within that line. And they weren't allowed to talk to each other. They weren't allowed to shake hands, hug each other, and, have all that. In Arizona, it was a shit show. The inmates would just turn out when they felt like it. Not really when they felt like it. So they would call the building. The inmates weren't ready to go. They would just, get it together and then eventually get out the door. And you had to make several calls, and then you had to make your last call, and then you'd shut the door. And then the inmates were still bullshitting around. They were still, and then banging on the doors. Oh, I gotta go to Chow and have a fit because they weren't ready. In Texas, when they put your building on standby for Chow, that means anyone that wants to go to Chow better line up. You line up at the door. So the inmates would line up at the door, and when time for Chow, you open the door and they walk out, single file, behind each other, no talking, no hugging, no touching, none of that BS. You just single file out the door, and you walk, and there's no drama. And then when you get to the Chow Hall in Texas, the officers would tell the inmates where to sit. So they would mix up the races, and they had the long tables, not the square ones, the longer Chow Hall tables. And we would shuffle up the line and make the inmates sit where we wanted them to sit, and we would purposely make them mix up the races. And sometimes we would split up inmates that we knew would get in trouble together or that were tight and close together. If you were friends with somebody or whatever, we didn't really care that much if you sat together if you weren't a troublemaker. But if you were somebody that was known that we had to talk to all the time to get your self straight, we would separate you, because there were certain inmates that would get together and they would just feed off each other and get into trouble together, so we would try to split that up. Inmates were not allowed to self-segregate in Texas. Self-segregating means when they have their own inmate rules and structures, and this goes on in Arizona, which I didn't agree with. So all the blacks would sit at different tables, and they had their assigned tables according to the inmates, and they weren't allowed to sit with other races. So they would self-segregate and only sit with their race or, you know, their gang or whatever. In Texas, that was never allowed. We would tell the inmates where to sit, and we would mix it up on purpose. In Arizona, inmates self-segregated. And yeah, because the Chow Hall is one of the most dangerous areas for officers to work is in the Chow Hall. And that's typically because you have so many inmates in a confined area in the kitchen, and if something goes off and something goes wrong and there's a riot in the Chow Hall, it's usually pretty bad and oftentimes deadly. So that is what the difference is for Chow. Arizona was super unorganized. Inmates would turn out. They'd be walking all over the place. They'd see each other and give each other fist bumps and hug each other. And these were the men. They would, and the women would do that too. It was they were just all over the place, walking around. Sometimes they would walk kind of around the track, and then you try to go get them, and then they would do this, and then you go this way, they would go that way. It was ridiculous. I hated that about Arizona. And there were a few times when there was a riot or problems, and they would try to get the inmates to just line up and walk the Chow and do it more organized, kind of like Texas did. It didn't work because you have too many staff that didn't want to tell inmates, get in line, be quiet, no talking, you know. And they didn't do the hands behind your back thing either. And that was really like bothersome to me when I went to Arizona because I didn't feel as safe. So kind of interesting about the night and day difference when inmates would turn out. There was no organization about that in Arizona. Inmates had no real rules. They would just turn out if they were told to or asked to. And in Texas, inmates didn't have a choice. Everybody went to Chow unless you had a lay-in. In Arizona, they didn't have to go to Chow. They didn't want to. They could just hang out in the building or lay around. The inmates did not have to eat in Texas if they went to Chow, but everyone was required to clear the building unless they had a lay-in and a lay-in is a doctor slip saying that they had to stay in their cell because they were sick or injured or whatever. And then we would have a tray brought to them. So in Arizona, they didn't have to go if they didn't want to. And in Texas, if you wanted to go if you had to go to Chow, you didn't have to eat. I mean, you could just dump your tray if you didn't want it. But everybody was given a tray, whether you wanted it or not. That way you couldn't say that you were refused food. So we didn't have to count. And then in Arizona, we had a count sheet. We had to mark off every inmate that ate so we could keep a count of how many inmates ate because they were keeping track of how much food went out to the inmates, and then canteen would charge the state for every tray that was sent out, including officer trays. So they would have to mark it off. We didn't mark all that off and keep a count because everybody cleared the building and everybody had to go to Chow, whether they wanted to or not. And if you were on a work crew, you got a sack. But you would eat breakfast before work, and then all of the other inmates that were in general population, they would all go eat too. So yeah, Chow Hall was completely different. They were allowed to talk to each other and stuff at the tables. And when we would look at the clock, say table number 3 sat down at 2:15, I think they got 10 or 15 minutes to eat. And when we felt like it was time for them to go, it could have been the time was up, or it could have been people were getting a little bit too rowdy and loud. We would just stand at the end of the table. We would go stand at the end of the table and just stand there. And then they knew it was time to go. And everybody would get up, dump their trays, and leave. They couldn't just dump their trays and get up and leave whenever they felt like it. They got up and dumped their trays when we told them to. We had complete control over the movement. When they got up, when they sat down, when they ate, how they walked to the chow hall. And we also kept a close ear out for, the volume level, about what was normal, what wasn't. If things would get a little rowdy, we just go stand in front of the table and say, get out. And then they'd all have to go. So I just felt a lot better about how things were run in Texas, especially with chow and movement and stuff. In Arizona, inmates would just go in, get their trays, sit down, and they would leave when they were ready to leave. We could tell them to leave when we decided the time was up for that building to eat. And then we would tell them to go. So, but as far as Texas, we went by the table, not the building. So I think it was more fair also for the inmates, because we went by the time when the table sat down. They had 15 minutes or 10 minutes. And when that time was up, they all had to get up and go. So I really liked that aspect about it. I liked it that they had to have their hands behind their back. It made me feel a lot safer. So the other thing is that when inmates come to talk to staff and approach staff for, I need a health needs request, or I need Tylenol, or I need to see a doctor, or whatever it is, all right? Inmates have to come up to you and approach you. And they have to have their hands behind their back to approach you. And they usually called you boss. In Arizona, they called you CO. They could call you CO sometimes in Texas, but they usually just called you boss. They would put their hands behind their back and approach you and ask for permission to talk. And you would say, what's up? And they would tell you what they needed, this or that. In Arizona, inmates approach you willy-nilly, waving their arms, complaining. They get all worked up and upset. They get too close to you. And this really bothered me. They would approach you sometimes in a disrespectful way, and we just had to put up with it. We just had to tell them, look, buddy, back up. I used to tell them, put your hands behind your back. Put your hands. Why? Are you going to handcuff me? No, put your hands behind your back so we can talk. Because when they're talking like this with their hands, you don't know if they're just going to haul off and punch you in the face. And it was very unnerving to me that in Arizona, these inmates really did not have that much respect for staff. It was willy-nilly. They would come up and talk to you, waving their hands around, talking with their hands. They would raise their voice and elevate their voice. In Texas, they could take an inmate down just for elevating his voice, because if the officer felt threatened, and we would be justified. In Arizona, oh gosh, you can't do that. But the inmates would do that, and it just really bothered me that they would just come up to you and be able and be allowed their body language and their demeanor. I found that when the inmates have to come up to you with their hands behind their back to talk to you, it generally calms them down. When they are able to talk with their hands and their hands get going, it almost makes them more and more excited or aggressive. When their hands behind their back, it forces them to calm down. It forces them to not raise their voice as much. And inmates generally just did not raise their voice at officers in Texas. In Arizona, it was like crazy. They could come at you sideways, and you had to de-escalate them. This happened sometimes in Texas, but not as often as in Arizona. Arizona was an everyday thing, you know. Inmates coming up to you complaining about something, getting mad about something, or disagree with what you're doing and don't like it, or don't want you to search their house, or whatever their problem was. They were generally a lot more disrespectful. And I felt like they were more dangerous because there was no control. And staff had less rights. We weren't allowed, they tied our hands behind our backs. There was a lot of things you couldn't say or do without getting into trouble. But the inmates could act all kinds of crazy and get away with it. So Arizona was much more difficult place to work than Texas. The other thing was that pat-downs and strip searches. Pat-downs and strip searches happened more often in Texas, was done more thoroughly than Arizona. In Arizona, we were, depending on the yard you were on, if you were on a higher custody level yard and the inmates would turn out for chow, they would just do this, pat them down as they would, leave. In Texas, the inmates would line up at the door. I would pat them down, starting with the first one, and move my way down the line. I would pat them down and do a good pat down in the dorm. And once you were patted down, you weren't allowed to leave the line. And I would stand there at the door and wait for them to call for my side of the building. Then when they called, I would let them out. And any inmate coming in or out of the building from a work crew, not the whole squad, not the outside jobs. These are the in the institution jobs, like necessities where you would get your clothing and laundry, or the store, or the porters, or the trash crew. Inmates that worked inside, it would turn out for your building. You would pat them down, and then when they would come back, you would strip them in. The building officer on the floor there was a lobby and like a bathroom area, and we would strip them in, the females, we'd strip them in the bathroom as they would come in. But there would be a few, or there would be one at a time, they would trickle in. And then we would do that, and then they would go into the dorm. So basically, the dorm officers were responsible for their own safety. We were responsible to make sure those inmates didn't have contraband. So if they did bring something in from their work crew or their job, guess whose fault it is? It's your fault. You're accountable for that. And I think that was a very fair way to manage that. Now, the inmates that came in from the host squad working out in the farm and stuff, or the outside crews, if they were working in the fields and stuff like that, those inmates, there's a lot of them. And so what they would do is when it was time for them to turn out or turn in, they would call officers from the buildings, and they would tell you, come do strips. And so we would all get in a line. The inmates would line up this way, and we would be here in front of each line. I think it was 4 or 5 lines, and it was a building that had painted lines. So the inmates would line up in an organized way, and then we would take each inmate and strip them out. And each officer had a trash can next to them, so any contraband or trash or serious contraband, of course, we would keep for evidence, and they would get a ticket. And also for the females, the Men's pads and the tampons and things like that, They would take the used one out of their clothing when they were stripping out and throw it in the trash can, because we didn't want them hiding stuff in there. And I don't think in Texas they got tampons, because they didn't want them using tampons to hold stuff in their cavity. So tampons weren't even allowed in Texas. In Arizona, the females were allowed tampons, which is, I don't think they should have allowed it, because they can bring in all kinds of stuff in that purse, right? And if you put it in backwards where the string isn't out, you might not even see it, that it's in there when you're doing a search. I mean, we're not, looking in. They just have to do the squat and cough. So if they do the squat and cough and they have a tampon in, that's not going to really come out, because the tampon swells up inside there to keep things from leaking. So I didn't agree with that at all in Arizona. In Texas, they just had pads, and they would have to throw the pad away, and then we'd give them a clean one, and then they would get dressed after we were done searching, stripping, and then they would go to the other side and wait by the door. They were allowed to talk and whatever, but they had to keep the volume down. And then we would escort them back to their buildings. So the larger work crews, we didn't strip at the building. We stripped at the strip shack. Well, a strip building. And did a lot of strip searches. All the females had to do it. There were no males allowed. But everybody helped out. The captain would be there. If the major was there, sometimes they would be there. The lieutenant, any female that's a sergeant, captain, lieutenant, whatever, COs, we all went in together. And, I really liked it that the captain would get involved. The captain would work with us side by side, doing the same job. We truly felt like a team, like we were all in it. In Arizona, the captain doesn't leave his office. You're lucky if the lieutenant will come out and help. They think that's beneath them, that they don't have to do that. And I don't think they do have to do that in Arizona. But in Texas, everybody has to pitch in, no matter your rank. You have to get in there and all work. And there was so much more teamwork. In Arizona, there was no teamwork. It was everybody out for themselves. In Arizona, they would call for people to do strips, and they just wouldn't show up. They would just be like, whatever. A lot of people sometimes would just blow it off and not show up. And unless they called you out by name, there was really no consequence for that. So they did what they wanted, right? So that was really weird. Texas was a lot better security-wise. I feel that the strip searches were done better. And two, when the captain is there, and the lieutenant is there, and the sergeant is there, and the COs are there, and we're doing strips, they're not only doing their own strip and have their own line of inmates to do, but they're kind of watching what we're doing. And so you're making sure you do it by the book. You're doing it the way you're supposed to do it. It's not half-ass. It's not, just lazy and just whatever, not paying attention. We were there to do a job, and we did it right, and we did it all together. And everybody did the best that they could. And there was times where females would get out of control or a little weird, be like, I'm on a strip, and somebody play me some music, and they would do that, beats and stuff by their mouth or whatever that's called. And we would shut that down real fast, and that inmate would be lucky if she didn't get a ticket. I don't think it was a major ticket, but they didn't allow any nonsense. And I really appreciated that about Texas. Let's see. Then we had the prisons. We had some other things. We had a annual time card. So I'll explain how this works. They would let you have access to all the different time cards. It would be like A through F. And you would look at the time cards and look at the days off and the weekend. Mainly people were looking for the holidays, because every day would shift one day over, and that way your days of the week you had to work were different every week by 1 day or 2 days. And so that meant that everybody got at least one weekend a month. It was usually 2 weekends a month off. So you could plan weekend events and stuff like that. And you could also look at these cards to see what holidays you're off that you don't have to ask for off, that you're already off. So all your work days are pretty much set for the whole year, and it shifts. So I think I did a video on this time card thing. And I really felt like that was a really fair way to treat your staff, that everybody got 2 weekends a month. And some cards had Christmas off, some had New Year's off. It just depended on your card and when it fell. And then you would put in for the card that you wanted, and they would go by your time in. So if I was a newbie, I got the card that didn't have any holidays. If I had been there a couple years, I had a chance to get maybe a holiday off. So you would put in for the card that you wanted, that coincided with maybe events you had planned for the, weekends or holidays that you wanted off for your family. You would put in for that. And then they would take everybody that had, put in for it, and they would choose the people. Say they need 5 people for F card. So they would pick 5 people for F card that put in for it according to their seniority and their time in the department. So I really felt like that was fair, because in Arizona, you would put in for the days you want, but it would be a set, every week would be the same. So if I wanted Saturday, Sunday off, I would have to put in for it. They went by seniority, supposedly. And then you put in for it, and you would have to wait until someone would quit or someone would leave. And then the people on the list would rotate up and take that slot. And it was about who put in for that first, not necessarily seniority. And if 2 people put in for it the same day, then they would go by seniority. But this left it open to manipulation by supervisors. So supervisors would underhandedly give their bestie or their hoe bag the days off that they wanted. It really wasn't a fair system. And so I didn't like that aspect of it. But the department had, in Arizona, a lot of other weird things too. Like they didn't have time clocks. Well, they started with a time clock but never used it. They had it removed because they didn't want us using the time clock, because they didn't want to pay us all the time it took us to get checked in and stuff like that. I don't think Texas paid us for getting checked in either, but I think they were sued about that at some point. So as far as our days off and time that we worked, I really felt Texas was more fair. I mean, I didn't get every weekend off. Like for a while towards the end of my career, I really couldn't even get a weekend off until I had 10 years in the department. I could not put in for a holiday. So say I wanted Christmas off or Thanksgiving off, they would have us do a dream sheet and fill out what days off we want for the year. And then they would go by seniority, supposedly. But if you've been there long enough, you know who's senior and who's not. And you would see who got that, and then you could grieve it and fight it and say, look, that's not right. I got more time than that person, and I put in for it. So it was a lot of infighting going on about stuff like that because there was supervisors that wouldn't do the right thing. The sergeants didn't always handle the time off that was put in. It was like a CO4 or a lieutenant or captain that handled that, depending on the unit and what the warden, deputy warden, how they would appoint, who would determine that. And if you wanted any other time off, say you have an event coming up, you would have to put in for it, and they would look at the numbers and see if they could approve you or not approve you. And sometimes they would, and sometimes they wouldn't. And in Texas, if you wanted additional time off, you would have to put in for it ahead of time as well. They usually wanted 2 weeks or more ahead of time for you to put in the time. And most of the time, you would get it. It would get approved. Sometimes it would get denied. Unless, like if it was a holiday or something, Texas wouldn't always approve it because they holidays were always short. You're always expecting call-ins. So, yeah, that's how that went. I really didn't have any problems with attendance in Texas. I always came in and did my job, and really, once I got my feet wet and started fitting in, I really, I liked going to work every day. It wasn't a nightmare. Arizona was a nightmare. I used to call in all the time because I hated it. So, let's talk about grievances. What's a grievance? A grievance is when an inmate has a complaint. They get a grievance form and they fill out their complaint. I don't like it that this officer took my clothes. This officer, said this to me, blah, 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 or whatever, right? In Arizona, the grievances would go to the CO3 or CO4, and they would deal with it. If the CO3 or CO4, sometimes they would come to you in Arizona and question you about it, and usually you didn't hear much back from it. Every now and then, if an administrator didn't like the way you handled things, they would call you in and talk to you. Sometimes you would get disciplinary, maybe if it was something really stupid that you did. In Texas, the grievance system was handled completely different. Inmates would get a grievance, they would fill out their issue and their complaint, and then they would turn it in. And then the supervisor would go through it and read it, and there would be a square response area for the officer. And they would take the grievances in briefing, and they would hand them out to different officers. And the supervisors would call grievances fan mail. They would say, hey, we got some fan mail here, here you go. And they would give it out to the officers, and they would tell you, just write a quick response, turn it in. They would congratulate you in Texas for getting complaints. In Arizona, they'd look at you like, you're a troublemaker. You're not being a nice officer. You're getting too many complaints. They used to say that about me sometimes. In Texas, they would be like, hey, you got like 4 grievances. Way to go. All right. And they would say, oh, Officer so-and-so, you're the officer of the week because you got the most complaints. And I'll explain to you where this comes from. The reason why they would say that is because most of the complaints that came through the inmates were complaining about, they weren't legitimate complaints. They could prove that the officer was actually following policy, and inmates didn't always pay attention to what the policies were. So usually, I've never gotten in trouble for it, for a grievance. I never got in trouble for it. I did get plenty of them, but it was always within policy because I was kind of by the book. And the supervisors and the captains and maybe even higher ups would look at these grievances and they would say, well, this inmate's complaining because she took her clothes, and then her response was she had an excess of clothes. So she took 3 shirts and 2 pants because she had more than she's authorized to have. That officer's doing her job. That's how they knew you were doing your job. And a lot of times we would welcome grievances because the inmates unknowingly would be telling your supervisors that you're doing your job and you're following policy. So that's kind of where it bit the inmates in the butt sometimes. The inmates never got in trouble for complaining, and the officers rarely got in trouble unless they really did do something wrong, which I never got in trouble for any grievances, and I got a lot of grievances. And the supervisor used to kind of chuckle and laugh and say, well, you know who's got at least one? And he'd hand it out, and I would respond. Sometimes I wouldn't know how to respond, and I'd ask him, look, this is what happened. What do you want me to put down? And they'll say, well, put down that the policy is this, and that's why you did it, because you were following policy. Sometimes I didn't always know. Sorry, I don't know why I'm choking on. Sometimes I didn't always know what the policy was for certain things. Policy in Texas, we had a little book we could go by, but we didn't have access to all of the different policies, and we didn't have access to computers back then. So I'm sure they had computers, they just weren't available to COs. So every now and then I would ask the supervisor, well, what should I put here? Or especially like when I was new. And they would usually tell me, good job. So in Arizona, you get a grievance and they'd kind of look at you like, what are you doing wrong? They didn't have you back in Arizona. They really didn't. They were more focused on the inmate and coddling the inmates and not holding people responsible. But they also coddled staff and didn't hold staff responsible a lot of times. Staff got away with crazy stuff in Arizona. In Texas, they were strict on the inmates, but they were strict on staff. So it was fair. They had high expectations of staff, and they didn't tolerate BS from inmates either. So it seemed to me like it was really fair. So almost all of the time, I was in agreement with the state and their policies. And let's see. So there's just so many differences. I mean, I started writing this out and I just kept coming up with more and more and more stuff. Only 2 things happened to me that I felt was unfair. One, I was being bullied by a lady. I don't know why she didn't like me. I never really talked to her. I didn't have any interaction with her very often, but she was really mean, and she was always like following me and threatening me or undermining me in some way. And she was just mean. She would say mean stuff, and I'm like, who is this lady? I don't even really know her. Like, how does she have a problem with me if I don't even really know her or converse with her? Like, what is wrong with her? And she would like taunt me and follow me out to the parking lot and threaten me and tell me she wanted to fight me. And I was like, I'm not fighting somebody at work in a parking lot. And I guess that was a thing, and I thought that was kind of strange, because if some officers in Texas had a disagreement, they'd be like, meet me in the parking lot. But honestly, if you get in a physical fight on state property, you get serious disciplinary. Besides, I wasn't trying to fight an officer. But she followed me and taunted me out to my car and was threatening me, and then we started arguing back and forth. I don't think, no fists were swung or anything like that, but she wanted to. Wanted to get violent. And I reported her, and then we both got time off. I got time off, she got time off. I'm like, I didn't do anything. I reported it. She's been taunting me for like weeks, and she's been bullying me, and you guys don't even do anything about it. And then she comes out and follows me to my car. She follows me to my car while she's threatening me and saying stuff behind me, and then I get in trouble too. They said, well, it takes two. It takes two to tango, and it takes two to fight and argue. What? I was ticked off. I was like, that's not fair. That's not right. I reported it because I didn't do anything to her. I don't even know. I really didn't even work with this lady very often. I don't like her. I just ignore people I don't like. I don't try to pick a fight with them. She was trying to pick a fight with me all the time. And then there was another girl that I complained about because her name was Easley. And she would come and relieve me, and then the dorm would just be off the hook. They would be running around. It would be like a nightmare. I would come in and have to get everything settled down. And after a while, when she wanted to relieve me, I refused. I'm like, no, I don't want to break. They can send somebody else. And then I tell the supervisor, can you send somebody else to relieve me? Because I don't want her easily relieving me. Because if she relieves me, I'm going to come back, and my dorm is going to be crazy. People are going to be running around. People are on the table dancing. And, women do weird shit. So she didn't like that. She was a dirty officer. I felt she was dirty. I mean, you'd have to be dirty to allow your building to be that out of control when you're in it. And her building was like a big party every time she was in there. And the inmates knew that, because when she worked the buildings, the inmates knew that she was, that they could party and do whatever they want with no consequences. I didn't work like that. I mean, inmates aren't stupid. They're smart enough to know the difference between me and Easley. They know Easley is just going to let everything go crazy. And then for a while, I also told the supervisors, look, I don't want to be in the control room when she's on the floor. Like, I don't even want to work with her ever. And they understood. And I was like, look, she's off the hook. I'm not trying to get hammed up and get in trouble because she doesn't know how to run a building. I don't run my buildings like that. And if you're in the control room when they're in the pod, you could get in trouble too, right along with her, because you're a witness to what's going on and you're not putting a stop to it or reporting it. And they kind of have like snitch rules for COs too. So if you call the supervisor, say, look, this is BS, sometimes then the staff will kind of get against you if you do that too much. So, and that's another thing that is different too in Texas. Officers, you'd have a floor officer and a control officer. Each building had 3 staff, 2 floors, and 1 control. So you would be in the control rooms, there would be a control room, and then there'd be a split in the middle of the control room, like outside of the control room, and there'd be a dorm on the left and a dorm on the right. And they each had 120 to 124 beds. And they would be just in rows. In that unit, we didn't have bunk beds. Each inmate had their own cell and 1 bed. So, unless you were in lockdown or F building. So, that was also another thing that inmates appreciated when they would get their score down, that they would not have to share a cell or a room with another inmate. So, when you're a floor officer, you pick a table in the day room, put your clipboard there, You put your food and stuff in the control room, in the fridge, and you have your radio, and you don't leave there. You don't leave the dorm. You work there, you live there until your shift is over. You eat your lunch there, you can get relieved and get a break and then come back, but you stay in that dorm on the floor. If it's graveyard, you stay in there all night. Sit at your table, sit in a chair, do your walks. In Arizona, you could leave the run. You could leave the building. You could leave and they could call you and tell you to go. In Texas, they never called you to leave your building. You stayed there with the inmates where they lived 24/7. 24/7, they had an officer in the run all the time. The control officer would stay in the control room, and their job would be they would get a phone call, turn your building out for Chow, or they would get a phone call, I need this inmate up at disciplinary, whatever. And then they would call on the intercom for the inmate to turn out, and then I would go to the door, check them out, pat them down, and send them out. So that's how all that worked, and I think it was a better system, better security-wise, safer for the inmates, and it also allowed you to really get to know the inmates. In Arizona, you come and go. You might have to go help with Chow or go this or that, and inmates are just left in the buildings. And they were left empty a lot. Like, there was a lot of times there's no officer around. Even in the cells, where you have two-man cells, oftentimes you're running both sides. You're doing checks on both sides. But you could go into the control room and chill out between walks. You could go into your break room and chill out over there. Sometimes they'll call you away from your building to help you with this or to help with that. So the only time an officer would leave the building in Texas, if you're a floor officer, would be to help do strips and stuff. But there would be one officer on the other side. They'd always leave one officer in the building, and that officer would do checks on your side and their side. So they would just spend the majority of the time in their assigned side. So we had like building 1, and then we'd have A pod and B pod. So if I was assigned building 1 A pod, that's where I would live for that shift. And if I had to leave for any reason to help with strip searches or whatever, then Officer Jones would probably be a male, and he didn't do strips or pats, so he would simply do checks on my side of the run and his side. But if it was day shift, chances are you practically had no inmates there because every inmate was required to work. Okay, so let's talk about that. We did a little segue into that. Geez, there's so many differences. In Texas, inmates had to work. They did not have a choice. They worked and got good time. They did not get paid money. Now, this may have changed, but when I worked there in the 90s, every inmate had to work. They had no choice. I don't care if you were in a wheelchair. If you were in a wheelchair or disabled that way, and there were inmates like that, they would make them sit in a circle with a bunch of little old ladies, and they would be sewing holes in socks and mending clothing. In Arizona, if the inmates didn't want to work, they would just refuse to work. In Texas, if you refused to work, that was serious. You'd go into lockdown. You'd go into the 1 or 2 man cell, and you're automatically going to go custody level 2 or 4. Refusing to work was a serious offense in Texas. In Arizona, they're like, well, he doesn't want to work. And in Arizona, they pay the inmates to work 50 cents, 25 cents, depending on what your job is. And they actually have really good jobs, like You could work at CME, or you could work for Swift, rebuilding semi trucks that were in accidents and get paid like $20 an hour. You could work outside jobs that were corrections, Arizona corrections industry type of contracts. They had, like, Papa John's had a crew. There was a trailer had a crew. They would make trusses. Those type of jobs for lower custody inmates actually made a decent amount of money, so they could pay off the restitution and send money to their family, and they actually had decent money on the books. Those jobs were coveted jobs because you could actually make somewhat of a living, you know, with those jobs. The inside jobs, like picking up trash and working in the kitchen and making food and being a porter, they paid anywhere from 15 to 50 or 75 cents, $1 an hour or something like that. They didn't pay much. But the other outside contracted jobs, the Arizona corrections industries, those jobs paid decent wages. We also had a Hickman's crew. I don't remember how much. I don't know how much they got paid, but they also had officers that would do security out there. I never wanted to work that job. I don't like commercial farming. I don't like to see how animals are treated that way, and a lot of inmates would get sick from working at those commercial farms. But they got paid decent wages for inmates, really. I mean, in Texas, they got no wages. You had a job, you were required to work that job, and if you worked those jobs and you didn't get disciplinary, you would get a fair amount of good time, and you wouldn't have to serve your full sentence. So those are the differences in wages and jobs and things for inmates between Texas and Arizona. In Arizona, there's probably more opportunities for inmates, and there's a lot less control, which can be good and bad for the inmate. You know, you can get, if you already don't have self-discipline and there's not a lot of good control at the prison, you're likely to get hemmed up and get in trouble and end up doing a lot more time than you intended to do. But the opportunities are there. And oftentimes these Arizona industry jobs, once you've worked there, once you get out, they will hire you as a civilian. So they have more opportunities in Arizona for the inmates in that respect. Let's talk about the numbers. Inmates to officers. Arizona is shorter on officers than Texas. In Arizona, they fudge the numbers all the time on staff. And oftentimes you might be running 1, 2, or 3 buildings because they're so short. Because they treat their staff like garbage. So a lot of people quit and don't stick it out. But oftentimes you might be doing security checks in 2 or 3 buildings. And when that happens, sometimes inmates die because there's nobody in there. There's no control officer in there, and you have 1 floor officer running between 2 or 3 buildings. And that's when inmates die. And I knew an officer that had an inmate die on him, and he had to take security checks for 3 buildings. And some supervisors sit in their office and they don't come out and do a security check. They work you into the ground. But some supervisors will come out and help and do security checks. It depends on the supervisor, but most of them, there were a couple that were good about it, but most of them would just sit in the office while you did work yourself into the ground. And this officer had an inmate die on him. He was beat up and died. And the state fired him, said it was his fault. And he said, look, I should never be in charge of that many inmates at one time. There's only 1 of me, and you're making me do 6 people's jobs. Basically 3 control officers, 3 journals, and 3 building security checks. That shouldn't be happening. He won and got his job back. So good for him. Arizona's fudges their numbers all the time to make it look better, to make it look like we have more staff than we do. It's total BS. They also, one way that they fudge the numbers is they completely take numbers and say, well, we have this many staff, but they eliminate positions. And so they add work to the staff. So you might be doing 2-3 people's jobs. So I might be doing my job in the building, but they're also going to make me escort my own inmates here and there and all over, right? When I should be in the building. That's a yard set's job. The yard set is supposed to escort inmates to get them to medical, to get them where they need to go. So they double, triple, quadruple up your work. And they say, oh, well, we don't need that. We don't need those. We're going to eliminate this position and that position. And they slowly start etching away all of the different positions. Because when I first started working there and they opened it up, we had 4 officers per building. We had 4 yard sets per side. Now, sometimes you have 1 officer running the whole side. For rec turnouts, for work turnouts, for chow turnouts. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. And then they say, oh, well, we have enough staff. We don't have those positions available anymore, so we're good. So it's total BS. They don't care about your safety at all. Administrators don't give a rat's butt. All they care about is that they don't get sued. Texas is different. As far as I know, I never saw them eliminate positions that needed to be there. I never had to run 1, 2, 3 pods, 4 pods, 3 buildings. I never had, I only got called out to do strip searches, and then the other officer would do the checks for you, like I explained. That stuff didn't go on. In Arizona, it's the Wild West out there. They'll just leave you, flapping in the wind. And then the worst thing is that you're doing security walks and nobody's watching your back. There's no control officer. So if an inmate wants to take you out, good luck to you. I hope you can get to your radio, because they could kill you. No problem. Because there's nobody in the control room to watch you. There's nobody in the building. So you got to either push your man down button. But trust me, the radio is the first thing they're going to take from you. All right? And the first thing they're going to do also is take you to the ground. They're going to take your radio and take your pepper spray. And then if you're lucky, they're not kicking you in the ribs and stomping your head and stuff like that. So Arizona was very dangerous. Because towards the end, when I was leaving, they didn't even have control officers to watch your back. And then when we worked at night, they decided inmates were complaining they couldn't sleep because the security lights were too bright. So what they do, they painted over them. And so I had to walk in the run in the dark with a flashlight. And then the inmates were complaining about the flashlights. It's crazy. Whole nother video, I guess. So inmates, Arizona sucks as far as that goes. Texas was really good about that. I really enjoyed it. So the other thing that's different is the academy for Texas and Arizona, completely different. Arizona had an academy called CODA, Correctional Officer Training Academy. We actually trained not with the sheriff department or the police department, but they had an academy in the same building. They have their own rooms, kind of set up like hotel rooms. You would share a room with 2 to 3 people, and then they had physical requirements where it wasn't as strict as the police for corrections officers, but you did have to do a certain amount of sit-ups, a certain amount of push-ups, and a run in a certain amount of time. In Texas, at the time, you had to get a physical from a doctor, which you also had to do in Arizona. But they didn't have a particular requirement physically for you to be able to run a mile in a certain amount of time, to be able to do so many sit-ups and push-ups. Texas didn't require that. And you have to remember, one of the reasons why they took away the physical agility tests and stuff was because they had to compete with the oil drillers and the oil jobs. The oil jobs made a lot of money. So they had to compete with that. And so in order to get officers to work in TDCJ, they did away with the physicality part of the qualifications. So to qualify in Texas, you had to pass a strict background test. You had to have no basic English and read and write and stuff like that. Basically an 8th grade education. And then you had to attend the college class, sort of, where they would teach you state law. They would teach you the rules. You would go over the manuals. They would teach you radio etiquette and phone etiquette. And they would teach you the laws and rules of the prison, what you can and can't do. They would have you reenact and act out different scenarios. They would prepare you for emergencies. They would prepare you for stabbings and violence and what their procedures were. They would teach you use of force and what you're allowed to do and not allowed to do. And they would also teach you how to do their paperwork, like their journals, and how to write a ticket and things like that, and how to write information reports and stuff like that. Arizona did all of that stuff as well, but they also teach you first aid and things like that. And they would teach you how to call an emergency on the radio and how to respond and what was expected. Arizona taught all of that stuff too, but you had physical demands of you. You had to be able to do certain amount of push-ups, sit-ups, and a run in a certain amount of time. And it wasn't easy. It was hard. I went there and I made it, but they also had like remedial stuff. Say you couldn't make the run, they would make you get on a bicycle and get your heart up to a certain rate. And they want to make sure that you can. They were a lot stricter on the physicals, and Arizona was a lot stricter on your physical activity that was required of you to get the job. So, and you can't get in trouble while you're in there. You can't drink and drive. You can't do all that kind of stuff. So the academy for Arizona was far more intense. In Texas, I just sat in a class for 6 or 8 weeks. I don't remember exactly how long it was. And then the most physical activity we had to do was to, walk around and tour a unit. If you didn't fall out during the tour of the unit, you're hired. So that was Texas, and that's they hired people. I know in CODA we didn't have people that were super obese or anything like that. In Texas we did. We had officers that were already obese before they started. In Arizona, you may not be obese when you start working, but towards the end you're probably going to be obese. Some people are. One is probably lifestyle. The other part is stress and cortisol. Cortisol causes you to gain weight when you're under stress. It gives you that belly fat and stuff like that. And there's a lot more violence and crazy stuff going on in Arizona, so you're under a lot more stress. Plus, administrators cause you a whole lot of stress, and the fact that they double, triple, quadruple up your job requirements, things that they make you do because they're so short-staffed, because they don't know how to treat people and they don't know how to pay people. They pay people crappy. So that, probably caused, people to get obese while they work there. But once you're in, you're in. You don't have to retest your physical. So once you're in, you're in. So unless you can't, I know one guy, they got rid of him because he couldn't even walk to his unit. He was so bad and so out of shape. And he was a lieutenant, and he wouldn't go to the buildings and sign off on the journals and talk to staff because he couldn't make the walk. He was so heavy. And they eventually, he lost his job because if you can't even walk to the building to check on staff if there's an emergency, how are you going to respond? You're going to respond from your office? Yeah, that's what he did. Eventually, he got fired for that. But so that's that about that, the academy. And then the rank differs a little bit. You have CO2s. You have when you first start in Texas, you're a CO1. Then after you've been there for 6 months, you're a CO2. Or no, is it? I think it's 18 months. Then you become a CO2. They don't have CO3s. In Arizona, it's CO1 and CODA, CO2 after your probation period is over. And a CO3 is a promotion where you have to apply for it and interview for. And that's to be an inmate counselor. And then they have CO4, which is a supervisor in charge of CO3s. And they're equivalent basically to a captain, I think. And then you have the sergeant, lieutenant, and captain, and major, warden, deputy warden. And that's kind of how the rank would go in Arizona. And Texas, it was a little different. It was a CO1, and then a CO2 meant you passed your probation. And then you had your captain, major, and all that. So that went, their rank differed a little bit. And most of my experiences in Texas was good. I liked Texas better. I would have liked Texas better than Arizona if I was able to stay in there. Also, I think we talked about segregation. I can't answer a lot of questions about gang stuff because I worked with the females and they really don't participate in the gang stuff like the men do. And housing for inmates in Arizona was like Match.com. They had to be housed according to the same race. So we basically segregated them because they wanted to be segregated, which I disagreed with. They had to be similar in crime. And you couldn't put a non-violent inmate with a violent inmate. I used to call it Match.com. So to house an inmate, had to meet so many different requirements. And sometimes when they would try to move an inmate, we had to roll 5 or 6 inmates up to move them all around just so we can find one space for one guy. So they're trying to find one space for one guy. You might have to move 6, 7 inmates and roll them up and move them to another bed to make room for another guy because of the Match.com program that they had to make it safe for the inmates. So I thought that was a little ridiculous. And in Arizona, they had town hall meetings where they would consult the heads of different races and gangs about programming and about things coming up and about rules and complaints about officers. They called it a town hall meeting. Texas, they didn't do that. They didn't want to hear from the heads. The heads didn't run the yards. Administrators didn't listen to the head of the blacks or the head of the Crips or the head of the Mexican mafia. They didn't listen to none of that. What do you mean you had a meeting with the Mexican mafias because they had some complaints and they want to influence the rules of the prison? That sounds like corruption to me. Inmates in Texas had no say on anything that happened in the prisons with the administrators and the rules and how things were going to be run. They had no say. None. And if you're in Arizona and you get too many complaints from an administrator, if you're a CO and inmates are complaining to the administrators about you, they're going to call you in the office and tell you, hey, calm down. Take it easy. Don't be so tough. I hated that. It used to tick me off. And I would tell them, look, if I'm breaking policy, fine. I understand you calling me in here. But you calling me in here because I'm following policy and an inmate is complaining about me following policy? I don't think that's right. Kiss my grits. Right? Total BS. That kind of stuff went on in Arizona, and I was always butting heads with administrators. Because in Texas, I really learned how prisons should be run. I really learned that administrators respected staff. They didn't respect staff in Arizona. They hemmed you up if they didn't like you. And I was always butting heads with administrators because they were really corrupt, and I didn't like the way they treated staff that did their job. The officers that did nothing and slept through their shift, never did their walks, caused all kinds of problems and trouble, got caught up in drama, was sleeping around with other staff, that was giving BJs to sergeants, lieutenants, and whatever, that manipulated the way the prison was run. Those officers got promoted and just kind of floated along and got the better posts, which I thought was horrible. But guess what? My integrity remains intact. My integrity remains the same. Y'all can put on this shit show if you want to. I'm not going to be involved in it. And you better be proving that I'm breaking some kind of policy before you try to discipline me, because I'm going to fight it. You know what I mean? Most of the discipline I fought, but then for a while, there was a while when I just got tired of fighting, and I quit fighting some of the disciplinary that they would give me. But it was total bullshit. There was a couple that was legitimate. I mean, we all make mistakes, but for the most part, Arizona treats their staff like garbage. And the bigger piece of trash you are, and the less morals that you have, the less boundaries that you have, the better it is for you, because administrators like that shit, I guess, in Arizona. Let me see. Oh, count was completely different in Arizona, and then I'm going to wrap it up here. We're doing, this is a long video, longest I've done. So for count was different in Texas. This is how we did count in Texas, okay? They would have a sheet of paper, and it would be cut in half. And it would have all the bunks lined up with the bed numbers and the inmates' names. You would do your count, and you would go to the bunk. You would look at, this part is the same in Arizona. You look at the ID on their bunk, on their locker. You would look at your count sheet, bed 1, inmate Jones. You'd look at the ID onto the count sheet, inmate Jones. Then you'd look at inmate Jones and the ID. Does it look like inmate Jones? Okay. Check. And then you'd go down the run and check each inmate by checking the ID, face to ID to roster, to count sheet. And that's how we would do count. And, when you're counting that many inmates, sometimes you make a mistake. Sometimes you check the wrong box. Sometimes you check it because you've been checking 20 so far. Check. And then you do a check on somebody that's out, and you kind of space it out. Or different things happen when you're doing count. And sometimes you just don't get it right. So then you take that little square paper and you turn it into the control officer window. Each side, A side, B side. Then you go to the door, and they open the door, and the officers switch from A to B and B to A. And then they check, but they're doing it blindly. They don't know what your count is. They're not supposed to look at the paper you turned in. They're not supposed to know your numbers or anything. Then they count, and they turn those in. If the papers you both did on each, if my count matched a pod, the officer that did it, and ours are the same on both sides, the officer in the control room looks at them and says, okay, the numbers are the same, the outs are the same, the ins are the same. I'm going to turn this in. So they call and to give them their numbers. I have 101 inmates out or in, whatever, depending on what shift it is. I have this many inmates out, this many inmates in, and they call it in. Now, if the numbers don't match, the officers' numbers don't match, they cannot recount their own building, and the officer cannot call in those numbers because they're wrong. They don't match. So 2 officers do the same count, and if they don't match, it doesn't get called in. They call a sergeant and say, hey, Sarge, I've got a discrepancy here on count. can you send an officer over here to do count? So instead of sending me to do count again, because I already got it wrong, right? They're going to send another officer over to do count both pods. And then when they do that, and then they call that in. And if that doesn't match, they send in down a sergeant. And the sergeant does the count. Or lieutenant or whatever. Now that doesn't mean you get in trouble. Nobody gets in trouble if your count is wrong. Because it happens. Shit happens. They don't beat you over the head with it. You know, they just want the count to be right. And then eventually, if we can't clear count for whatever reason, because maybe an inmate wasn't put on an out count, there's a lot of different reasons why they don't clear count. They bring in all the outside work crews in and redo count with all inmates in. If they're not on the unit, they bring them in from the unit. From wherever they're at, they bring them home and make them all do count. So that takes quite a while. In Arizona, it's different. If I call in my count and the officer says that's not right, and if I did the count, I call it in, not the control officer. And they're not supposed to tell you the numbers. They're not supposed to tell you who's out. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they don't. They're not supposed to. And if you get it wrong, they tell you to recount it. So you go recount it. And if you get it wrong a few times, then they have the control room officer go count or something like that. Yeah, I think the way Texas does it is better, personally. So, yeah, that's kind of a joke. And then, usually the sergeant or sergeant usually does count on the weekends. During the week, they're on day shift, the captain does count. In Arizona, COs do count. I don't agree with that. Count's the most important thing that we do. And they put in CEOs in charge of count, the count boards, the movement sheets, all of that stuff. And that's the captain's job in Texas. So that's different. Though a sergeant is supposed to be present, and if something goes wrong, the sergeant's the one that gets held accountable, and the CO. In Texas, you don't see COs doing count. I mean, you know, taking count numbers and actually responsible for the whole unit's count. No, you don't see that. Disciplinary for Texas and Arizona is night and day. Night and day. We both do LOP, which is loss of privileges or loss of property. Arizona doesn't follow up and get the property most of the time. They don't put it on the count sheet that person's on LOP. They don't follow up on any of that. So if an inmate gets in trouble in Arizona, goes to his disciplinary hearing, and they say, yeah, you're guilty, we're going to go in and you're on LOP, which means loss of privileges and loss of property. Loss of privileges means you probably can't turn out to church. You can't turn out to any special events going on. You lose your property, like your radio, your TV, and things like that. In Texas, if you're on LOP, you're on LOP. They put it on the count sheet. Every officer that works that building knows you got in trouble for disciplinary. And trust me, if you did something you shouldn't do, especially disrespecting an officer or hurting an officer or something, trust me, all the other officers back you up. All those officers are going to be checking to make sure you don't have a radio, that you don't have any property or store in your cell. One of the first things they're going to do is go to your house and make sure you don't have stuff in there you shouldn't have. And when you get back from disciplinary, they come in immediately. So you have your disciplinary hearing, they find you guilty. Guess what? That hearing officer escorts you back to your house and clears everything out. Takes all your crap. And any other officer after that works your building, they check and make sure you don't have stuff you've borrowed from your neighbors or your friends. You can't borrow somebody's radio because you're on LOP. So Texas tickets mattered. Texas tickets had consequences. Behaviors had consequences. In Arizona, none of that mattered. It just didn't feel like disciplinary. Officers, yeah, you're guilty. They put it in your file, but there's no real, the only real consequences you get in Arizona is sometimes you might lose good time if it's a really bad, or you could lose your job. In Texas, you lose your good time, which is a big deal because now you're going to serve your full time. And sometimes you could serve more time for serious offenses, but usually that has to go through the court. But inmates would be very upset if they think they got a ticket. Inmates would beg you in Texas, don't write them a ticket. They would apologize to you if they screwed up. And it would be officers' discretion if they still turned in the ticket or not. And we didn't have to tell inmates that we wrote them up or not. They would have to sit and wait and see if disciplinary calls them and worry about it for days before they even would find out if they got a ticket or not. In Arizona, we had to tell the inmates, you're on report. And then we had to put in the ticket, inmate Jones was put on report on this day by this officer at this time on this date. Look, that's BS, all right? You're setting me up to get punched in the face because if the inmate already has a temper, can't control himself, and I have to go up to him and say, you're on report, that puts me in danger. You know what I mean? That's crap. You shouldn't have to do that. Put yourself at risk. The inmate already knows he's screwed up. You've probably had a discussion with him that he's screwing up. I shouldn't have to go back later and say, oh, by the way, you're on report. What the heck? That's some ducked up policy right there. You're putting your staff at risk of getting hurt over a ticket. Arizona, you sucked. That sucked. So, in Texas, it was my discretion. If an inmate come up and say, look, I screwed up. I'm really sorry. If they did it in publicly in front of the whole run, like said something like called me out of my name or cussed me out or acted out in some way or was hiding at count time or something, which they do, crazy. So then they would apologize, and sometimes I would say, okay, I tell you what, you need to apologize to the whole run because what you did in disrespecting me was in front of the whole run. So you need to apologize and be humble in front of the whole run. Then I'll dismiss your ticket. And so they would do that, and I wouldn't write the ticket. But then there were other times if I thought it was serious enough, or I've had other problems with this same inmate over and over and over. No, I wouldn't dismiss the ticket. I would definitely write it, and I would put in that ticket, I have written this inmate up for this, that, and this in the past. This inmate is an ongoing problem. And then they would probably change his custody level and send him up the road to a higher custody. So if I really wanted to push it in Texas, it meant something. They did it. So inmates didn't act out as much as they did in Arizona because they didn't get away with it. Inmates are going to do what they get away with, right? So that I really liked about Texas as well. Inmates in Texas did not have their own TVs. In Arizona, they had their own TVs and their own cable. When I got there, I was a little mad about it at first. Like, why would they give inmates their own TV? I don't think they should have their own TV. Do they deserve to have their own TV? I mean, they're in prison, right? And we're paying for their cable, the taxpayers. Like, I was upset about that when I got to Arizona. But on the flip side, after working there, the TVs were a good babysitter. The TVs gave the inmates something to do and something to get their mind off of things. So they weren't trying to trick bag me all the time. In Texas, they didn't have their own TV. In Texas, they had a TV in the day room, and everybody had to vote on what they wanted to watch. And then I had the control, and I would change the control channel and take a vote. And then I'd have to write down or put a tick on each inmate on my count sheet that was sitting there voting on the TV show. Because what they would do was the races would manipulate the vote. So there would be, you know, the blacks, the whites, and the Mexicans. Well, the Mexicans would get everybody to come out their bunks, sit on the benches, and vote for what they wanted to watch. And then they would all leave, and there would only be 3 Mexicans sitting there when there was 8. But so in order to avoid that, we would write down who sat there, and whoever sat there and voted for that show had to stay there for the entire show. So they couldn't manipulate the vote. So that's the difference now. Whether they have their own TVs now or not, I don't know. But that's how we did it in Texas. In Arizona, inmates had their own TVs, which eventually I came around to thinking, you know what, that's not so bad. It gives the inmates something to do and entertains them, and it keeps them off my neck and off of my back, you know. So inmates having their own TVs was a good thing. And let's see, what else? There was less corruption that I saw in Texas. Of course, I wasn't there as long, but I really did not see the effects of corruption. I was not aware of dirty things going on. You know, they had high expectations of their staff and stuff. What went on with administrators, they treated our staff with respect. That didn't happen in Arizona. I'm sure there is some corruption in Texas, but I was not really aware of it. Staff worked together more. It was more of a team effort. Hands down, I preferred Texas and the way they run their prison and the system. I preferred them because it was black and white in Texas. There's too much gray area in Arizona where, you know, anything goes. And they're more inmate, pro-inmate than staff, pro-staff in Arizona. They're pro-inmate, they're not for the staff. And in Texas, they backed you up. They were pro-staff, but they didn't put up with BS either. They didn't put up with lying. They didn't put up with bringing in contraband. They didn't put up with you mistreating inmates. They didn't put up with you. I mean, they expected you to be professional. In Arizona, people got away with crazy stuff they would have been fired for a long time ago in Texas. In Texas expected you to be professional, and if you weren't, you would get disciplinary. If you got too much disciplinary, you were fired. So I definitely preferred Texas, and that's where I got my experience in the beginning. That's where I learned and decided to be by the book kind of officer, and I learned a lot in Texas. And yeah, I loved Texas. And if I was to do it again, I probably would do it in Texas. So that's the end of the story. That's the end of the differences between Arizona and Texas. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe. And I really appreciate everybody that subscribes and watches the videos. It really helps me a lot if you just take a second and smash that like button and subscribe. I have a lot of content. I'm going to start doing some lives eventually. I really appreciate everybody that participates. Thank you. You guys have a great day.